All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome back in. I got my man Lucas Wilder here with me tonight for another segment. Always excited about these. Going to do something really special here for you tonight. So his dissertation. Lucas, how are you, man? And thanks for coming on.
Oh, I'm doing great, Chris. I'm happy to be here, and I'm thrilled to be discussing my dissertation, something I've been working on for the last about 5 years.
5 years. Okay. So let's get started with it, man, because you told me a little bit about it. And I think this thing's really exciting. I've got a lot of questions for it.
That sounds great. Yeah, let's kind of talk about the Appalachian Mountains, as a as a whole. Now we think of the Appalachian Mountains as a place for people to go to relax for vacations. And if you go to visit the most visited national park in the United States, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, you'll inevitably pass the Hatfield-McCoy dinner feud and other attractions capitalizing on what outsiders call hillbilly culture. Appalachia is much more than that, but mountains have consistently, throughout history, been seen as a location full of backward people opposed to modernization. Just think of the Beverly Hillbillies; they were supposed to have been from the Great Smoky Mountains, and so
Yeah, I like those
that
movies, though, long term.
Oh, Beverly Hillbillies was wonderful, but it has a long history to it, though, and it has there's actually has an impact of the Civil War to the Civil War as well. That long history of viewing the Appalachian Mountains as a place for backward people or people that are, lost in past generations. The Southern Appalachian Mountains itself is made up of three physiographic subregions. Now, that's a big word, simply meaning that these regions of mountains were formed at different times and in different ways. So we've got the Blue Ridge, which I don't do too much on. I don't talk much about the Blue Ridge. My main focus is the other two regions, which is the Ridge and Valley region, which is where, if you're thinking of East Tennessee, it's Knoxville, that big corridor of East Tennessee where the major cities are: Knoxville, Chattanooga, Bristol, Johnson City, and Kingsport. And then the Cumberland Plateau, which is, if you think of the mountains of southeastern Kentucky, Harlan County, Kentucky, the bloody Harlan, all these backwoods of Kentucky, this is the Cumberland Plateau. Early explorers of the regions noted these differences. So they commented on the Ridge and Valley region as being kind of an agricultural paradise. One reason that it's such a good place for agriculture is because there are limestone bases. There's a limestone foundation for a lot of these fields that people are planting wheat, corn, taters, all this, and it provides a great source for agriculture for people. However, if you go into the Cumberland Plateau, it's made up of some of this young soil. The young soil is key to it being a kind of barren wasteland because this new soil, it's kind of young, so didn't have time to gain any nutrients, so um, it can't foster this huge agricultural production that East Tennessee can. And you're saying, what does this have to do with the Civil War? Well, it has a lot to do with the Civil War because when we look, I guarantee you can correct me if I'm wrong. You've heard of the Shenandoah Valley is called the breadbasket of the Confederacy, right?
Yes, sir.
The breadbasket of the Confederacy. I was doing my research when I was starting this out. I was going through the agricultural census for 1860, so right before the Civil War begins. I was looking through what is East Tennessee supplying to the country at large, and I found out that East Tennessee is supplying more wheat, corn, potatoes, anything, whatever a soldier would be issued during the Civil War than the Shenandoah Valley was.
Hmm.
The Shenandoah Valley is known as the breadbasket of the Confederacy, yet East Tennessee supplies more wheat than it did. And not only that, when we look at the military involvement in the Shenandoah Valley, we see the Shenandoah Valley changes hands multiple times before it's actually completely held for the Union. However, East Tennessee was not. It actually stayed in Confederate hands all the way up until 1863. So when we look at why Appalachia is important to the Civil War, It actually supplies a whole lot of food and sustenance, as well as other natural resources like salt, which is important for not only for the tanning process to make leather goods for these soldiers that are going into battle, but we also see salt used to preserve meat. And so the hog meat that's being served to or rationed to soldiers is being salted by the salt from southern Appalachia. So this is why I go into why I love the environmental history of the Civil War, is because we can put all these factors into understanding how the war progressed and was, built, bolstered by southern Appalachia, particularly East Tennessee. But we also see the barrenness of the Cumberland Plateau, which keeps keeps armies from moving through it, and we'll get there here in just a moment. Um, we'll see with East Tennessee being this, this agricultural paradise for a lot of people. eh, We usually think of East Tennessee, or let's say Appalachia in general, as being a place where you don't have a lot of connections with the outside world, that it's secluded, that it's not many people know about the outside. You don't have many connections outside of just that little region, and that's not true. Although there are some isolated locations, we see that there are agents from Savannah, Georgia, coming all the way into East Tennessee to a little place near Rogersville, Tennessee, that is making deals with the local farmers there to send goods down to Savannah. So it's not a geographically isolated place. There are people that the South depends on a lot of the southern Appalachian resources, particularly corn and wheat from East Tennessee. And one thing that the Cumberland Plateau or southeastern Kentucky does provide, and that's hogs. Hogs are going from Appalachia down to the deep south, where they're being fattened up on corn from East Tennessee that they're getting from East Tennessee, and those hogs are being fed to slaves, which are picking the cotton, which creates this this economic cycle and circle that goes around. And the South depends on Southern Appalachia. So it's the South is dependent on Southern Appalachia for a lot of its goods, and for it to survive itself. So
But a lot of the people there are lukewarm on the war, right?
absolutely. Well, we'll get there
Okay.
a little bit, but we'll cover a part of it here because it's exactly it's relevant to what you just said. These people in Southern Appalachia, they we see it throughout any region, but particularly in Southern Appalachia, where they're asked to join the army and to be drafted into the Confederate Army, and they just don't want to go. They don't want to leave their region. It becomes such a big backlash that Jefferson Davis will create partisan rangers, particularly in Appalachia, and those partisan rangers generally don't leave their region, although they will. One of my ancestors was a partisan ranger, created under the Partisan Ranger Act that Jefferson Davis signed into law, and he wasn't supposed to leave the region, although he ends up going all the way to Petersburg. His brother goes all the way to Washington, D.C. during Early's Valley campaign, and he'll fight at Chickamauga. So he fights in two theaters of operations when he's really not supposed to leave the region, in theory. So yeah,
Okay.
we get a huge difference of mindset in Southern Appalachia, and I have yet to find a historian who adequately describes why we see East Tennessee be very pro-Union. When we look at the service records, it's about 50%. 50% join the Union, 50% join the Confederacy. So there is a big split, and we see that same split in your area, in northern Alabama. We see those the mountaineers of northern Alabama, which are part of the Cumberland Plateau that I was just talking about. They will be um, adverse to joining the Confederacy, and many of them do join the Union. So, so that's the agricultural situation we're looking at. Southern Appalachia is vital to the South, and the South knows that. And so when the Civil War breaks out, both sides will try to get to it. Um, and even and but the Confederacy will hold on to East Tennessee, that place where all the agriculture is coming out of, for about 2 years, a little over 2 years. Now, the second part of my dissertation, the second chapter, is discussing what military theorists think about mountains. So I went through and looked at a bunch of different theorists, but I concentrate on four mainly. Antoine Baron de Jomini.
Oh, one of my favorites.
Yeah, Jomini fought in the Napoleonic Wars. He wrote the book on military theory, literally.
Mm-hmm.
I also look at Carl von Clausewitz.
Oh, my other favorite.
A wonderful theorist. He was a military man, and he writes quite a bit on mountains. And I would talk about Henry Halleck. You don't think about him being a military theorist that would be influential, but he definitely was. He went to West Point, he learned about Jomini, and he wrote his own book about military theory. And so I use his book, and also use a man that many people don't know, but they should. His name is Dennis Mahan. Have you heard of him?
I know. Oh,
Yeah, most people never.
Class, I'm sorry. I had a class called War in the Modern World one time, and it studied Halleck, but all those guys were in that.
Yeah, Dennis Mahan. He is arguably the most influential man of the Civil War, but he didn't fight in it. He was a longtime professor at West Point and trained most of the Civil War generals who went to West Point. I mean, this man had an influence with everybody. And so I chose him as well. So those are the big four that I chose to highlight in my dissertation on, and highlight what they talked about as far as mountains go. What should a commander do when he's confronted with mountains? One thing all of these men have in common, for the most part, they tell the commanders to avoid mountains. That's almost universal. Do not go into the mountains. The mountains are a place where a small army can defeat a larger one. That's dangerous. If you don't have to go into mountains, don't do it. Fight in the plains, fight in the open. Another thing they highlight is that it's difficult to sustain oneself in that country. This plays a significant role when we look at the Civil War. When Civil War commanders are going to be deciding on whether they're going to go into mountains or go back into the mountains, many of them refuse to, and we see that's kind of ingrained in them from their time at West Point, that mountains are a place that you don't want to go with your army because you can be easily defeated by a smaller force. It's and it's hard to sustain yourself in that kind of country because there's not a lot of agriculture. And it's true, especially in the Cumberland Plateau. Now in East Tennessee, that's different. But in southeastern Kentucky, that is a scary place for armies to be. Although they don't say it explicitly, they do talk about fear of inhabitants of the mountains and their wildness. The inhabitants of like the mountaineers, Jomini will actually say mountaineers are fairly good fighters. If you can get them to join your army, it'd be wonderful to actually use them as kind of a special forces. But he says you've also got to be careful of them because they can also be used against you. And because they know the terrain better than you, they know the mountains, they can use the terrain against you. And so these four commanders, or these four military theorists, are vehemently against going into mountains. But they say if you do have to go, you need to be very mobile. And keep that in mind because that's going to come up at the very end of our little discussion here. Stay out of them, but keep mobile. Be very quick when you're going through mountains. So that's the second chapter of the dissertation, where I take those four military theorists and I kind of dissect what they thought about the mountains. Now, the third chapter is, what did the average American think about Appalachia? You know, when you're in the antebellum period, if you're an Easterner, if you're in New York, what do you think are in the mountains? It's kind of like today. What do we perceive as being in the mountains? I work with the public a lot, and I've actually had people come up to me in the visitor center and ask me, do the people around here have running water, and do they have to go to the bathroom in an outhouse? I'm like, yeah, we're pretty modern. It's not that backwoods. And so
I thought of that movie Wrong Turn.
yeah, it's a wild thing that people still think of Appalachia as a very backward place, which in some respects it can be considered that.
Or the Andy
But
Griffith show, The Darlings.
let's say that again.
Andy Griffith show, The Darlings.
Oh yes, yes.
I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. Um, so we will. So in my third chapter, I talk about that average American's thought, and the way I do that is I take travel writers. So there are people from all over the world and the United States who travel around the United States and write about it, write about the journey. They didn't have the Discovery Channel or the Travel Channel back then. They didn't have TVs. And so one way to understand the outside world was to read books and read newspaper articles about people who have traveled in those areas. And so I take a whole bunch of travel writers. Some are from England, some of them are from the northern United States, and they talk about Appalachia. They talk about the mountains. And the reason I use those is because the average American, if they have not been in the mountains, this is what's going to influence their mindset. And when we hear these travel writers talk about the mountains, we can better understand what preconceived notions and stereotypes they're bringing with them into the mountains. And so one thing we find is that many of them say the mountains are beautiful. It's a beautiful place to be, but in the high elevations, that can lead to extreme weather, particularly in the wintertime. And so we'll see a whole lot of travel writers, especially if they travel in the wintertime, talk about the horrid winters that can be found in the mountains, when in the valleys it's it's a very mild winter. And they nearly all mention the savagery of the mountaineers, that these are backward people, almost in a feral state, uncivilized and barbarians. They're barbarous. Um, Many of them talk about how the Appalachian people are like kind of a couple of generations removed from the antebellum period, saying that these people in the 1830s are living as if they're in the early 1700s sometimes, that they're still in the hunting frocks of the long hunters from the mid 1700s. They're living like those people in log cabins. They're not in actual houses, they're in these log cabins. There's a great story of one gentleman who travels through the mountains and finds a family of giants. All these people are like, there's 9 members of this family, all of them over 7 feet tall. And
Wow.
that just builds on a stereotype. They come into the mountains with a stereotype. They'll even say that they've heard about these wild people that are just uncivilized. One man runs into a family where this man has to keep his family away from the outside world because some of his children are just so uncivilized. If they went out into regular society, they would be killed. They would be hung for committing some kind of crime. I mean, these travel writers are, some of them are exaggerate, and many of these stories are not true, and that's okay. I'm not talking about the validity of their statements. What I try to emphasize in the dissertation is that these stories help reinforce the stereotype of the mountains as a dangerous and wild place.
Ah,
So that's the third chapter, is discussing what is the average American's understanding of the mountains and the people within them. And it's simply it can be surmised as being simply a wild place full of uncivilized people.
so perception is not always reality.
Exactly. Perception is not always reality, but people will actually perform actions with stereotypes in mind. So, with that, let's jump into the Civil War. We've got the background of what I'm talking about. Now, let's jump into the war itself. Most of my research revolves around the Cumberland Gap in the Civil War. It's this main passageway that Daniel Boone has made famous, and when these Civil War generals, particularly the first Civil War general to be put in command of East Tennessee, his name is Felix Zollicoffer. He's from Nashville, Tennessee. He's a newspaper editor, and he's you can actually understand, you can hear it, you can see in his reports that from his understanding of Daniel Boone coming through the mountains using the Cumberland Gap, that it is the way through the mountains. It's the only way to get through these mountains. So his mentality is, well, if I'm going to protect the vital agricultural resources of East Tennessee, let me just seal off the Cumberland Gap. And that means there's not going to be no invasion coming through there. Sounds rational. However, once he gets to the Cumberland Gap, he realizes there are 43 gaps in the mountain range that he's trying to guard. Cumberland Gap's not the biggest one. So he tries a strategy that he initially wants to seal off all those gaps, either with men or put obstacles in the way. He gets scared. And it's honestly the honest truth. He gets scared. And he decides that since the Union Army are raising troops just about 20 miles north of the Cumberland Gap, let's just go and bust up all these recruitment camps and destroy any force that is in the immediate vicinity, because that's the only way I'm going to defend East Tennessee, because there's just too many gaps for me to guard. So he invades in September of 1861. Zollicoffer invades southeastern Kentucky to bust up a Union recruitment camp, which he does in Barberville, Kentucky. After he busts that up, you can almost immediately see in his records his army is starting to wither because of the lack of food, and the mountains themselves, which are creating a lot of work for these soldiers having to march over mountain ranges. Those soldiers are talking about how tough the job is, how tough the marching is. Many of these men are coming from Mississippi and Alabama, the southern portions of those states where there are no mountains and very few hills to speak of. And so they're being introduced to mountains that they're unacquainted with. And this terrain is wearing on them. It's not just basic army life. Now there are landscapes involved that they've never encountered before. And so his army, he talks about not being able to find food in southeastern Kentucky. And again, that's because those young soils we mentioned before can't produce the agriculture that East Tennessee does. He can't live off the land. And he's trying to stay there with about 8,000 men. And they're just starting to eat all the food in the entire area. And where they're getting that food from is the civilians. How does Zollicoffer describe the civilians? He's describing them as backward, as ignorant, as people who don't understand what's going on. He's using those stereotypes that he has read and he understands on those people. We can take food from them because they're not, they don't understand that the war is going on, because they're kind of they're insulated from the war itself, kind of thing. His army will eventually fight the Battle of Camp Wildcat in October of 1861 and be defeated. And he has to retreat back through the Cumberland Gap. And he decides at that point, since I can't invade and defeat the Union Army, any Union forces in Kentucky, I'm just going to seal off all the gaps. And that's what he does. That becomes the second strategy, and the only one and a strategy that most Confederates attempt to do, which is to seal off the gaps in the Cumberland mountain range, hoping that no one can invade East Tennessee. Remember, East Tennessee supplies a lot of wheat and a lot of corn to the war effort, and you need to protect it at all costs. So this is very vital. So we already seen that with the first invasion of the Cumberland Plateau, it's ended in failure. Now let's talk about the Union. The Union troops that are going to invade southeastern Kentucky for the first time is a force under George Washington Morgan. It's the 7th Division Army of the Ohio. About 10,000 men are going to be marching to the Cumberland Gap. The Cumberland Gap is fortified with about 10,000 men themselves, roughly. And when we talk about the Great I know you've probably heard of the Great Locomotive Chase.
Oh yeah.
Disney made a good movie on it. Really good film.
Yeah, I remember.
The Great Locomotive Chase actually happened. It was actually, and if you watch that film, they do mention General Mitchell. And that's an important character here, or important character in the film, person in real life, because General Mitchell actually made a feint towards Chattanooga. Chattanooga is a vital railroad hub. You need to keep Chattanooga in the Confederacy. And when General Mitchell, acts like he's going to attack it, plus the Great Locomotive Chase happens, the Confederacy gets scared and they pull a bunch of their troops back toward Chattanooga to protect the rail lines. They also pull back those troops that are stationed at Cumberland Gap, right there where Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee meet. When they pull those troops back, Morgan's 10,000 men sweep in and take the Cumberland Gap without firing a shot. Now, they've suffered in southeastern Kentucky so far. They've been susceptible to scurvy, some of the soldiers were, because they didn't have enough vitamin C in their diet. But now they're at the Cumberland Gap, right on the precipice of the Ridge and Valley region. And that's what they used East Tennessee for, is they'd send out little raiding parties from the Cumberland Gap for about 20 miles around in East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, getting food. That was their main goal. Let's try to sustain the 10,000 men that were at Cumberland Gap. But once the Confederacy moves back in and the Kentucky campaign begins, Edmund Kirby Smith is moving. He's the commander of the Department of East Tennessee once Zollicoffer is killed at the Battle of Mill Springs. Kirby Smith will circle around the force at Cumberland Gap and move up north towards Richmond, Kentucky, leaving a small force to lay siege to the gap. George Morgan will evacuate the Cumberland Gap, exploding mines along the road, exploding the parts of the cliffs, and also blowing up his ammunition depot, leaving a huge crater that you can still go to today. And he retreats all the way to the Ohio River, a couple hundred miles, in a horrible heat of September of 1862. Is a miserable situation. The men are surviving on nothing but berries and stagnant water. They do get do find some clams that one soldier said and had some clam chowder, but it's a very miserable march back to the Ohio River. One reason that mission fails is because they simply can't get enough food from southeastern Kentucky. It's already been destroyed by Zollicoffer's troops, who have foraged for it all in the community. So Confederates have Cumberland Gap again. This is in September of 62, and they hold it for exactly 1 year. The force there decides on Zollicoffer's last strategy. Let's just seal off the entire Cumberland Gap and all the gaps that are around it. That way no one can invade East Tennessee. And to a great extent it works. However, there's a man that you know very well, and most people listening do. His name is Ambrose Burnside. Now, he had had a horrible disaster at Fredericksburg. Everybody knows about that debacle that basically wasted troops outside of Fredericksburg. However, once that happens, Lincoln sends him west, and he commands a corps in Kentucky after this. At this point, this is August 1863. So Gettysburg's happened, Vicksburg has happened. The Union Army is moving towards Chattanooga again, and this is going to result in the Battle of Chickamauga and eventually Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain. So picture Rosecrans is moving from Nashville down to Chattanooga, and they actually coordinate an attack with Burnside. Now, Burnside is not a dumb man. He's schooled in military theory, and he's learned something from all these other invasions of southeastern Kentucky. He is going to invade, but instead of moving a force of about 10,000 men along the same road, which is going to be difficult, it's going to be slow, and his men are going to starve because there's lack of food there. What he does is he splits his army, which is about 8,000 men, or his corps. I won't say his army, his corps. He splits his 8,000 men up into 5 different columns, and they march and on 5 different roads and enter the state of Tennessee at 5 different locations. The furthest east column will go to the Cumberland Gap and try to capture it. The rest of the columns are moving a little bit further to the west. And by doing that, not only is he moving them on different roads and split them up, but he's mounted about half of them, roughly. So they're on horseback. And remember what I told you, that many of these military theorists said if you're going to move through the mountains, you need to do it very quickly, if you have to do it at all. And that's what Burnside does. He invades East Tennessee, captures Knoxville, Tennessee very quickly, finds out that that column that's supposed to capture Cumberland Gap is not there, is not captured, that is. And so he sends another brigade to surround the Cumberland Gap from the south. And so now it's completely surrounded. The commander at Cumberland Gap will refuse surrender, saying that he's not going to surrender and he's holding out. He's got a small force, about 2,000 men. He's opposed by somewhere around 4,000 men at the point. At that point, Burnside's getting irritated that they can't capture this one location, so he brings another brigade up. This makes them nearly 6,000 men that are surrounding Cumberland Gap, and personally asks for the surrender of the Gap. The commander of the Gap, General John W. Frazier, realizes that if Burnside's at the Gap, that means that Knoxville has been taken. That means that the closest Confederate force to him is about 100 miles away. And so he surrenders to Ambrose Burnside. Burnside is a hero. He does very well in the Western theater. It will be Burnside who has to fight General Longstreet. After the Battle of Chickamauga, Longstreet's sent north to Knoxville. They have a battle at Fort Sanders and a few other battles, Campbell Station, Bean Station, and Morristown, a few battles around East Tennessee, and Burnside holds him off. Burnside's an excellent commander. I think putting him in charge of an army was the mistake. He wasn't able to coordinate that, and plus he had Washington on his back. With him moving out west, he had a much better, he was more lax restrictions on him than being that close to Washington D.C. But he captures Knoxville, East Tennessee, and the Cumberland Gap very quickly and fairly easily. And it's all because of the way he designed his invasion routes, and how he reorganized his corps to being very mobile. And we see that even after. And so East Tennessee, Knoxville becomes like a staging ground for invasions into Southwest Virginia. Southwest Virginia has Saltville, Virginia. It's called the salt capital of the Confederacy. It supplies the Confederacy with salt. Remember, to make leather and to preserve meat. They will use mostly mounted forces. Somewhere around 5,000 to 10,000 men, many times, to move out from Knoxville and attack Saltville, Virginia. They do it twice, once in October and once in December. The December battle actually results in the Confederacy or the Union capturing Saltville and the Confederacy losing that vital resource that they've been needing. And so all the wheat in East Tennessee that's been captured by 1863, all the salt production that's supplying Robert E. Lee's army and the Army of Tennessee is now gone. Now the troops are truly abandoned, essentially, with food. There's still food around the country, but these huge locations that have wonderful resources are gone. This is one of the big nails in the coffin. And when people ask me what is the turning point of the war, I never say Gettysburg, and I hardly ever say Vicksburg. I say one of the biggest reasons that the Confederacy loses is because in September of 1863, by September of 63, Chattanooga is taken and East Tennessee is taken. And I proved that East Tennessee is supplying a lot more of supplying a lot more corn and wheat than the Shenandoah Valley is. And when you take that away, the Confederacy was truly doomed when those locations are taken. So, any questions?
I've got one kind of off topic that's
okay.
But I got to think about something a while ago. You said the Blue Ridge Mountain. I mean, it's kind of on topic. Have you ever heard this quote? I've never been able to actually source it or put it to on his lips that Lee said if he could at the end of the war, if he could make it to the Blue Ridge Mountains, he could hold out for 20 years.
I've heard that, and there's the historian's name is escaping me now. I know it just about as well as I know my own. He basically goes into explaining that the military man that Lee was, and even Johnston was, they would never have tried to do an irregular warfare. He may have said that, but the possibility of him actually doing it is actually negligible. He probably would never have done it simply because he was accustomed to regular warfare, and doing irregular warfare is seen as being kind of being cowardly, and
Right.
plus of the bad blood that would occur from that. But yeah, and that those statements like that go back to all those military theorists talking about how smaller forces can defeat larger ones in mountains. And we see that Robert E. Lee is the son of, of an American Revolution veteran, and
Mhm.
his father was right there in the Southern campaign with the Swamp Fox, Francis
Right.
Marion. And Francis Marion was known as he was an irregular force, but he worked with regular forces in the American Revolution. And in the American Revolution, we see people talk about the mountaineers, the over the mountain men that defeated Ferguson at the Battle of Kings Mountain. I mean, that's a huge moment, and it's these mountaineers who are these tough fighters, and because it's in the mountains, they know where to go. I mean, this is it all builds towards the American Civil War in that respect, as far as mountains and military theory go, and I think they keep that mentality with them all the way through the war. And we see that play out in action after action of these Civil War commanders. Any other questions?
Let's see. When you said there was 43 gaps, I mean, how big are these gaps like for people to get through? I mean, how big of a force can travel through there?
You answered the $1,000,000 question. You asked the $1,000,000 question. There are 43 gaps in the Cumberland mountain range. That's not even counting all. I mean, that's just one mountain range. That's about, we'll say it's about 150 miles of mountain range, and there's 43 gaps in it. That's considerable amount of gaps. Most of them are labeled on Civil War maps as being simply bridle paths. Meaning that you have to get off your horse and lead it over. Like you can't even ride a horse over it. I mean, it's so steep. So
Okay.
those are not feasible to get through. You know, you could get a few infantry across if you needed to, but it's not a place that you're going to bring artillery and everything over. There are actually only about 4 gaps in the Cumberland mountain range that would be easy for artillery and infantry and cavalry to come over it together. So I say 43 gaps, and that seems like a lot, but when you're Zollicoffer, and he knows that if 100 men get across one gap and are able to pester you from behind, that's significant. So even though these are smaller gaps, they are still important to the overall strategy of protecting East Tennessee.
Burnside, you used to talk about him dividing his force 5 different columns. That's pretty bold, isn't it? I mean, you get balled up with 1 or 2 of them, or get isolated, you're in trouble.
It is. It's a gamble, but it's a
Calculated.
it's a well thought out gamble, and he knows that there's really no force that's going to oppose him as he's going to be entering East Tennessee. And if there is any, his troops can withstand any force that is still there. Only thing he's going to be harassed by is maybe some guerrillas that are out there in the mountains, and his men can take care of that because you're dividing about 8,000 men up into 5 different columns. It's over 1,000 men per column. They can take care of themselves, but it is a risk. If anything is thrown off, if there's any kind of resistance, and there was resistance again at Cumberland Gap, it's the only one that stops a column from moving. But Burnside quickly brings his troops up. He's masterful in the East Tennessee campaign. I can't sing his praises enough. He gets a horrible reputation because of Fredericksburg, rightly so. However, he does do a great job when he comes west, and that can be said of a lot of commanders. When Hooker is sent west, he's very good in the Western Theater. Just look at Lookout Mountain. So
now, did these columns, did they have artillery and cavalry with them? I mean, they could work independently, or?
Yes, most of these columns, even the infantry are many of the infantry units are even mounted, so it'll be mounted infantry.
Right.
And you've also got, yes, there are artillery. There's at least an artillery battery with each column, I do believe.
Right.
So they are moving pretty heavy, but they are moving very fast compared to what the other armies that tried to invade that region were. That's one thing that fascinated me to no end. And when I read Burnside's account of him mounting his troops and dividing them up into those 5 columns, I was still writing my thesis at the time, and a light bulb went off. I was like, "That's it." It was his strategy that actually kind of put my thesis over the top and made it a good one. That there is a strategy that gets developed of mountain warfare, and that's what the dissertation is about: is the history of mountain warfare in southern Appalachia. How does it impact the war? And Burnside was wonderful at mountain warfare. He understood it, and I would have to go through his personal records, and I don't, and I think those are in Rhode Island. I haven't got a chance to go do that research yet, but I would love to know if he actually, what was his influence to do that. I'm theorizing that it's actually him studying what's happened before in those regions, but I can't be for sure yet.
Now,
Hopefully I find out later.
when you say influence war, are you talking about all the way down now, like what the 10th Mountain trains for?
I'm talking about the mountain warfare that he sees coming up from, from Zollicoffer being starved out of Appalachia to George Morgan being starved out. All these implications. One thing I didn't mention was that one man that Burnside puts an entire column under the control of is Samuel P. Carter. Carter is a fascinating individual, and if anyone has not heard about him, I encourage you to do a little bit of research, because you'll find he's one of the neatest commanders and probably one of the best brigade commanders of the Civil War. He's from Elizabethton, Tennessee, so he's from the mountains, and he was an admiral in the United States Navy. During the Civil War, he becomes a general.
Huh.
He will he will be with George Morgan on his capture of the Cumberland Gap. So he moves through Appalachia. He understands it. He's from the mountains. He will be, once George Morgan evacuates the Cumberland Gap, Carter will do his probably one of the most successful, definitely successful Union raids by cavalry in the history of the war. I think it's honestly, I do think it's on par with many of Jeb Stuart and Nathan Bedford Forrest raids.
Wow.
He takes about 900 men, just 900 men, and goes a couple of 100 miles, burning railroad bridges, destroying one locomotive, taking hundreds, maybe a couple thousand prisoners. Although he does parole them, he can't carry them with him, and he makes it all the way back to the safety of the mountains of southeastern Kentucky, invading the Ridge and Valley region, but escaping back into Kentucky very quickly. Within just a few days, he covers all this amount of land in this huge circle. I've got it on a map, and I'll try to send it to you before this video comes out, so you can actually see the route that he goes.
Okay.
Carter is incredible, and so he's not only with Morgan. He not only does his own invasion of East Tennessee and succeeds because his men are mobile. They're very fast, and they're moving through southeastern Kentucky fast, so they don't have to survive on the forage that they would normally have to do. He's also on the invasion with Burnside. So he's been influential in 3 of the major invasions of East Tennessee, and he's performed one of them by himself. And it's because of him, I think he's the key that is telling these men, telling these commanders, his superiors, you have to be fast to get through these mountains. Like I said, I got some more research to do as far as what's the influence on Burnside, but Carter, I think, is one of the keys to that. And like I said, if anyone's interested in learning about a brigade commander that you normally don't hear of, Samuel Carter is one of those men.
Interesting. I've never heard of him. I have to look him up.
Samuel Carter. He's if I'm not mistaken, he might be part of the Carter family, from
I wondered that
June Carter Cash and married Johnny Cash. So
yeah, I wondered that when you said that that area.
Yeah, I love studying the Civil War in these less talked about areas, because you get introduced to soldiers that you wouldn't normally get to hear of because they're not part of the major armies, and they do just as good stuff. Another man that he travels all over the war, but his name is Seth Barton. He's a great Confederate commander. He's a brigade commander, And he's part of this strategy that Zollicoffer has of protecting East Tennessee, and he's basically waiting on the other side of the mountain. So if any Union troops come through, he goes and defeats them, and just keeps doing this for the better part of a couple months. So Seth Barton is a great example. Um, Alvin Schaff, he's a Union commander that doesn't rise up too high, honestly. I mean, as far as prestige goes, but wonderful commander. He's actually Austrian-Hungarian. Gets kicked out of his own country, and I think he was a teacher at a as an artillery instructor at a school in Turkey, and then goes to Washington D.C. is basically at a desk job. Civil War breaks out. He's got military experience, so they throw him in. He's the one who defeats Zollicoffer at the Battle of Camp Wildcat. But he's a great commander. But these wonderful commanders that don't get the prestige that these other ones do because they're not in these main armies. They're kind of on the periphery of the war.
Okay.
So that's the dissertation. It's been a work in progress. Like I said, about
So
5
you
years.
said sorry, it caught me off guard. I was trying to take it all in. So you just said you worked on it for 5 years.
Yeah, the dissertation's been going for 5 years, but I've been studying this for about 12 years. This particular location of the war.
So you put that. Wow, that's amazing. You put that much time into that one area right there. So I mean, the importance of this. I mean, what would you rank it in as far as the war goes? I mean, one of the top areas.
My dissertation advisor said, when you're making these claims, make them very big and bold. And
Okay.
I do think that once this dissertation is published, we're going to see a third theater of operations. We've got the Eastern Theater, we've got the Western Theater, and we've got what could either be termed the Central Theater or the Mountain Theater. And so that's the Appalachian Theater. These small events that seem negligible anywhere else, that most people's not going to pay attention to, are actually extremely influential to the overall scheme of the war. East Tennessee supplies all these goods to the Confederate armies. If that's taken, that diminishes the impact of these Confederate armies, including Robert E. Lee, who's getting a lot of his wheat for his army from East Tennessee. So when that's taken, it is a death knell in the Confederacy. And so I combine it with Chattanooga to mean that this is the true turning point of the war, and it's its own separate theater because people react differently when they are in Appalachia because of their previous military experience or because of their previous ideas about the mountains themselves.
So this would become like the small nuts and bolts working together for the whole picture of the war then, because as this goes, so goes the war, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. The sideshow of the big show. It's extremely important to the war. To understand the war is to understand Southern Appalachia and what's happening in it. Again, people concentrate on the big armies, but what's happening on the periphery? What's happening with these smaller engagements that maybe don't lose thousands of men, only lose a handful, but are integral to protecting, like the salt works of southwestern Virginia. I can't emphasize enough of how important the salt out of southwestern Virginia is. Everybody knows this. I mean, Jefferson Davis talks about protecting the salt works because it's that valuable to his armies. And the only reason the Confederacy survives is because they have armies. That's the importance of this dissertation. That's why we should know about it.
Wow, how did you lock in on this particular key area of it?
Well, it's mostly where I was from. I was born right here, 10 miles from the Cumberland Gap, and it started off when I was going for my bachelor's. You have to write a senior writing requirement, and so I said I've been doing research on the Cumberland Gap, so I'll write my 20 pages on it. So I did that, and then when I went for my master's degree, I just expanded that and turned into 130 pages for my thesis, talking about and I'll talk about how the steps on how I focus on the topic here in a moment. And then once I went from my dissertation, I just expanded from the thesis to now it's around 300 pages of work, 300 pages to
Wow.
talk about this. I started off trying to figure out what am I gonna write about? How am I gonna frame this? Because you can't just write a history. I mean, that's pretty
Right.
low in the scheme of historical writing. If you're just writing a history, it has to mean something. There has to be some reason why you're writing it. It can't just be I just want to know the history of it. And so, actually, Nathan Bedford Forrest is responsible for a lot of what I'm doing. Forrest
Oh,
is
really?
yeah, Forrest is an incredible commander when it comes to utilizing cavalry. Him using cavalry as kind of mounted infantry, you rush into battle, dismount, and fight. Um, that played a huge role. I started reading a little bit about him, particularly some of Bruce Catton's books, and from there became fascinated with cavalry and their movements. How are they trained? What are they taught to do? The difference between them and dragoons, and Wilder's Lightning Brigade is very similar. They rode into battle, then dismounted and fought with those Spencer repeating carbines. So those two men, John T. Wilder and Nathan Bedford Forrest, kind of lay the foundation for my ideas towards this dissertation, or back when it was just a thesis. So I was like, okay, we see these men utilizing mobile units very um, very well. And I had already wrote 20 pages on the Cumberland Gap in the Civil War, and when I read through it, I was like, these men are changing their style of combat. They're going from these 10,000 man infantry units to very mobile cavalry or mounted infantry units by the end of the war. There's a transition there. There's an evolution of mountain warfare. And
Mhm.
so that's what initially got me into my thesis, was talking about the evolution of mountain warfare in southern Appalachia, because that's fascinating, because we see the other historians have talked about there's an evolution in the way men fight during the war. One of the big ways is trench warfare. Men will
Right.
very quickly, soldiers realize if you stop at any moment, and the enemy's coming, you know the enemy is close by, you throw up breastworks, you throw up some kind of impediment to block any bullets. And so we see trench warfare develop, it evolves through the Civil War. And we see the same thing with mountain warfare. It evolves, it goes from these very rudimentary linear battle lines that they think they need to use to being very mobile units that fight these battles, right into battles, and then dismount to fight. And so that's the evolution that uh,
Yes, I never knew anything about these mountain battles.
and when I started writing the dissertation, I talked about it in my thesis, but I didn't expand on it much. But I knew that the reason they were changing their method of warfare was because of the terrain, the mountains themselves. You can't fight linear line battles like you do at Gettysburg in the mountains of Appalachia. So they had to change. And so when I started writing my dissertation, I have those first two chapters, or actually just the first chapter and then a little bit of the third chapter, that talks about the mountains themselves, the perception of them and the reality of them, and why the mountains are going to impact the armies, but also why the mountains are important for the country at large. And so that's where my environmental history comes into play. So
So
it's been a long process.
let's back up for just a second now. In 1861, when Lee and McClellan went, was it Cheatham? The Battle of Cheatham? Was that it?
I I'm blanking on it. That I know exactly what you're talking about though, because we see because Lee goes against McClellan in West what's now West Virginia,
Mhm.
and um, those battles are and Lee loses.
Right.
And the mountains are a unique beast. Lee will say this. When he becomes commander, he will tell people, if you're going to go into the mountains, take someone with you that knows the mountains. He mentions John B. Floyd. He's a horrible commander. He gets captured or he abandons his post at Fort Donelson. And And he says use John B. Floyd. He's from those mountains, and use him as a commander in those. So he knows that the mountains are difficult to get around in because it's from personal experience. He failed at it. He knows he didn't know that terrain well, and he's a great engineer. He tells people use people that know the ground, and that's in my dissertation because people realize that you need mountaineers, and that's why Samuel Carter is important. He's a mountaineer. He's fought mountain warfare before. He's had this experience in the war. Now he gets to use it.
I asked earlier I don't know if you're familiar with any of their training, but have you ever seen what the mountain warfare, how they're trained today? I mean, can you see that relatable?
I talked about it a little bit in my thesis, although I didn't focus a lot on it. It was kind of like in the epilogue, just a few, just a little bit at the end. What I do know, or what I do remember from my thesis, is that there's two things that happen with mountain warfare today. Well, actually, three things. One of them is they use those guides still today. If the United States Army goes into mountains, one of their first steps is to get someone who knows these mountains extremely well.
Right.
So there's the one thing. The other one is stay mobile, which we still have from the Civil War. And those tactics are still applicable today. And the other one is just like I equated it exactly to Knoxville, Tennessee. When you're in mountains and you fight in modern day military, you have a base of operations that can be well supplied. That's Knoxville in the Civil War's case, and then you use basically hit and run tactics, not in a irregular sense, but in a quickly moving group of men. So if you should use that base of operations, and then you venture into the mountains and attack, and then come back. Venture into the mountains, attack, and come back, and just do this repeatedly. And so yes, the modern military do use tactics that were, I would say, developed in the Civil War.
Okay. I mean, this is absolutely fascinating. I've never thought about the mountain warfare aspect of it in the Civil War. I mean, I've never really heard anybody talk about it.
And not many people do. I'm one of the few that actually know about mountain warfare, at least to this extent.
Well, I'm glad. Oh, yeah, I'm glad you picked this for a dissertation and opened my eyes to it. That's some. I would have never tied all those little small bolts, and screws working in this whole big picture here until you showed it to me.
Yeah, and most people, when they talk about mountains, they talk about guerrillas, irregular warfare. And I was like, I don't want to talk about that because there was a lot of regular units in the Southern Appalachian Mountains. We need to talk about them. And that's another thing that spurred me onto this. I was like, I'm tired of hearing about guerrillas. I don't think they had that big of an impact. That can be debated. And there's a great historian, Daniel Sutherland, who does a great job talking about it. To a certain extent, he's right, but I don't think it's not as important as the regular Army units. And that's what kind of spurred me on to looking at Burnside, looking at George Morgan, looking at Samuel Carter, all these men that were regular Army units, and they performed beautifully in the mountains.
Yeah, because I knew Burnside went west, and they knew a little bit about him at Knoxville, but I didn't know how well he actually performed west. I mean, he doesn't get the credit he deserves for overcoming his adversities.
No, he doesn't. Fredericksburg is what he's known for. It's sad to say, but that's all. That's what most people remember him for, and it's sad because, again, he does some great stuff in the West, and he fights off Longstreet in East Tennessee, and he holds him off. It's a beautiful thing what he does in East Tennessee, and I can't sing his praises enough. He's wonderful in the West. You move him back east, he has trouble, and you just look around Petersburg. He has trouble there. I don't know why when you move them east they have that much problems.
When did he get moved back east?
He's going to move back east he does this in late '63, so he's back in the east by about mid '64, I believe.
So you got Burnside's Bridge, Fredericksburg, and the crater.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This has been fun, man. I'll tell you what, send me since this is your dissertation, send me some images you want me to use, and I'll put that up there for the video.
All right, I can do.
Okay. So what do you want to do next time, man? It's getting close to the holidays. I don't know if you want to jump in and do Fredericksburg.
I'm getting ready to do an animated battle map on Fredericksburg, so that would actually work out pretty well if we wanted to
Okay,
do
yeah.
it.
Yeah, because about 2 weeks, and then take me a week to usually get it. Yeah, that'd be fine. We'll do Fredericksburg. That was when I took that class, War in the Modern World. I was really disappointed because that was the one we studied different battles from each war, and that was the battle the professor or the teacher had us study was Fredericksburg. I thought, man, of all the battles there, that's one we're going to study.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a wonderful battle because the battlefield study as far as military goes, because there's not a lot of different terrain value to it. I would much rather study something like Chickamauga, which has
You
so
got
many
one
different
battle to
terrain
pick.
styles. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of so many I would rather study besides besides that one, but that's the
Or
only pick.
study Ulysses S. Grant's Vicksburg campaign, probably one of the
Yeah, that would have been
greatest
great.
campaigns ever done. That would have been beautiful to do.
Yeah, but that's the one he picked, and I was like, man, this is kind of you know, uh, give me Chancellorsville or something, besides this right here of men just running up the hill to get slaughtered. I think that probably Gods and Generals did a great portrayal of that. I don't think it could get much closer than what it was like.
No, I think they did a really great job. One aspect of it is when you see, particularly Chamberlain's men charging up the hill, you can actually hear the bullets whizzing through the
Yeah,
air, and I think that adds a lot to it. But you don't have that in the movie Gettysburg. That reality of what the bullets sound like, or what sound like hornets, as some men will say. So that aspect alone makes it a great film that they paid that much attention to detail.
yeah, I agree. I mean, the explosions from the cannons. I mean, it was just how they went. Hancock sitting on horseback ordering one unit forward after the next. I'm surprised somebody's, hey man, are you crazy?
Have you started watching my series on Hancock?
No, I have not started watching that one yet. When did it? How many episodes have you got out?
Uh, it's three. I think it's three. Yeah, it's
Okay.
on
Yep.
part three. If you want to know how General Hancock liked to eat his taters, that's on episode 3.
Well, I'll start watching that tonight after the football game. Then I'm not somehow that has not came with my feed yet to watch, but I will check that out.
Yeah, like I said, you're going to get to know something very funny about Hancock and how he eats his taters, as opposed to how General Winfield Scott does.
Oh, I love all of them, man. I get so much information there. I thought, oh, that's so cool to learn that about these guys. It makes them human.
It does, and that's the beautiful thing about it, is to make them human.
Yeah, instead of just a picture, that's frozen in time. I'll have to send you a picture that I can't figure out. I've got 2 paintings of Lee, and I can't figure out how where these paintings came from. But he's in a blue uniform, but he has solid white hair, like he was in the war. I know before the war started, he had mixed color. His hair was still salt and pepper. And I don't know if these were just what am I working with? A fake, or if they're actual paintings of him. I'll send you a picture of them.
That's strange. I don't think I've seen that.
Yeah, I'll snap a picture of it and send it to you. Actually, I've got 2 of them. I forgot how I came across both of them, but he's in a dark uniform and his hair's solid white. So I don't know if they're that's what I'm looking for. Not, it's like plagiarized or phony or I can't remember. I'm drawing a blank, but yeah, I'll send you some. But I've never seen these before, and I mean, anything. Google them. I've never seen these before. I don't know, where it's at. But yeah, I'll check those Hancock's thing out, man, and I'll just wait for you send me some images of this. But I enjoyed that dissertation. That's some good stuff there, man.
I'm glad. That's working on it for 12 years. I'm glad somebody likes it.
Well, yeah, because I just never I've never put that together and never even thought about putting it together of how integral that was to the whole war effort for the Confederacy. Sometimes that makes me think, well, why did the Union not put more in to, take it sooner?
Well, Lincoln wanted it. Lincoln wanted it taken. That's one of his first initiatives.
Oh, really?
This is in October '61. He says, "I want the Cumberland Gap seized and the railroad beyond it." because the railroad runs from Knoxville, Tennessee to Richmond, Virginia. And if he can cut that rail line, he can cut the Confederacy literally in half. He says that in
Huh.
61. And Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, is in command of Kentucky at that point, and he will say, "I need 200,000 men to do that because it's going to be it's going to be nearly impossible for me to move through the mountains to get to it." And so he just doesn't go.
I didn't know that either. Lincoln said that's amazing.
Let's trying to think. Let's do a short episode one day, one week, and I'll simply talk about the bridge burners.
Okay, yeah, whatever you want to do, fine with me.
And that'll talk about what I just talked about with Sherman and Abraham Lincoln wanting the Cumberland Gap taken. It shouldn't take me more than about 10, 15 minutes to talk about, but then we can have discussion afterwards, of course. But it'd be a simple, short video, but I think people really enjoy it just because it's a unique point in the United States in Civil War history that a few people know about, but not many people know a lot about. It's really good history.
Yeah, just let me know when you're gonna do it. We can set that up. And one other question. I remember we talked a while back. Did you ever look into because I think we was gonna talk about this one time how the remnants of the Army of the Tennessee made it to North Carolina that fast? I think there was some you was looking at some railroads or something. I remember.
Yeah, I talked about that in I talked about partial. We talked about how they got there. We didn't talk about kind of what happened to them once they got there. I thought, yeah.
Well, I thought that we discussed too that we thought that all the rails had been destroyed, and you said, well, maybe there wasn't any destroyed, or they got put back together really fast enough. I can't remember, but yeah, we can figure that out too.
Yeah. I'm enjoying these, so I'm up for discussing anything.
Yeah, I love these, man. These are my highlight of my week. Friday night Monday night now every 2 weeks. So yeah, this is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm glad you're enjoying it. Like I said, I'm enjoying it too, and me kind of putting all my thoughts down about my dissertation really helped me because I'm on the last chapter right now, and I'm about 3 pages away from being done.
Okay. So when will it be published?
That's probably early next year. I'm hoping it'll be published by the Mississippi State as a dissertation. It won't be published in book form, although you can get it in book form. It's not going to be like from the University Press of Kentucky, one of these. It's just going to be on file as a dissertation at Mississippi State.
Okay, yeah, keep me informed when that comes out.
Sure.
All right. Well, good deal, man. We'll talk soon.
That sounds good. We'll talk to you later.
All right, buddy.
Okay. Bye.